Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that is honestly pretty fascinating and often totally misunderstood. We're talking about the intersection of faith and personal finance. We're going to be looking at some foundational source materials from pioneers in biblical finance to see what the text actually says about our bank accounts. It's a wild ride, going from a complete mindset shift all the way to super practical, everyday money management.
But all right, first things first, we've got to address the elephant in the room. Why is money such a taboo topic in so many faith circles? The irony here is actually kind of staggering. If you look closely at the text, Jesus talked about money and possessions more than almost any other topic, except maybe the kingdom of God. And yet in modern settings, the conversation is completely avoided, or, only brought up when it's time to pass the offering plate. Well, today, we're flipping that script and looking at what the source texts actually teach about financial literacy. So here's our roadmap for today. First, the taboo topic of money. Then we'll look at owners versus God's managers, dive into the prosperity gospel trap, lay out the 5 financial pillars, and finally wrap up with the rich fool's warning. All right, part 1, the taboo topic of money. Look, financial literacy is desperately needed everywhere, and that absolutely includes inside church walls. But for the longest time, the practical mechanics of money were just ignored by spiritual leaders. Our sources point out that Christian financial pioneers, specifically guys like Larry Burkett, who founded Christian Financial Concepts back in the 70s, they really began to break this silence. Through books like Debt-Free Living, Burkett highlighted this massive, fundamental truth. The biblical text shows that God cares deeply about how we handle our finances, from how we earn it to how we spend it and how we save it. It's not just about tithing, it's the whole shebang of holistic management. Moving right along to part 2, owners versus God's managers. Okay, let's dive into this foundational shift. To really get a grip on biblical finance, our sources say a massive paradigm shift has to happen in how we actually view our resources. First, you have the ownership mindset. This is where we think everything we earn is 100% ours. But the texts emphasize that the minute we begin to own our stuff, well, it begins to own us. Our possessions possess us, and that creates just endless stress. Now contrast that with the stewardship mindset. This is the totally liberating biblical view that God owns absolutely everything, and we are simply the managers of his property. So by definition, stewardship means managing someone else's resources. In this specific context, it means managing God's gifts according to his purposes rather than just for our own, personal gain. The sources challenge us with a really direct question here. Who is your real boss? Are you putting your ultimate trust in God, or are you just trusting your next paycheck? Honestly, if we don't get this principle right, the rest of the financial advice we're going to talk about won't make any sense. Section 3. The Prosperity Gospel Trap. To understand this concept fully, we have to look at how stewardship is interpreted across different circles. We're drawing here from an impartial breakdown provided by the Stewardology podcast. Check out this contrast. The sources define biblical stewardship as viewing wealth as a tool to serve others, right? Whereas the prosperity gospel views it as a personal right or a reward for having enough faith. Stewardship is all about trusting God's provision. The prosperity gospel, on the other hand, relies on transactional seed faith. Basically, this idea that if you give a certain amount of money, God is somehow obligated to multiply it back to you. One focuses on deep contentment, the other is this constant, exhausting pursuit of wealth. And this brilliantly illustrates the core theological difference highlighted by our sources. The prosperity gospel often teaches a name-it-and-claim-it philosophy. It treats faith almost like a manipulative force to create a desired reality, speaking wealth into existence. This contrasts really sharply with the traditional biblical view of trusting God's sovereignty. That means having faith in God regardless of your financial or physical circumstances, and recognizing that, hey, trials and hardships are just part of life in this world. All right, heading into Section 4, the 5 financial pillars. Having established that theological and philosophical mindset, let's see how this builds a tangible toolkit for everyday life. According to the Effective Church Group source, there are 5 financial pillars that individuals need to master: banking, budgeting, saving, debt management, and investing. Let's walk through these together. First step is budgeting. Proverbs 23 reminds us that careful planning builds a house. A budget isn't some financial straitjacket, it's simply a spending plan. The sources highlight frameworks like the 50-30-20 rule, that's spending 50% on needs, 30% on wants, and saving 20%. But the absolute key to making this work, you have to track every single penny in a spending journal for a month. Literally every penny. Because you simply can't manage what you don't track. Now, what's really interesting about this next piece of data is the sheer scale of the problem we face with the next pillar, which is debt. Our sources note that $100,000 represents the average debt, including mortgages, currently carried by Americans. When you factor in all that choking, high-interest credit card debt, it really highlights the crippling nature of modern consumerism. We end up buying things we don't need with money we don't even have. So the crucial point here is that the biblical text views consumer debt as way more than just a math problem. It's actually a form of servitude. The proverb says, "The borrower is slave to the lender." This is exactly why biblical principles strongly advise keeping out of debt, cutting expenses, and emphatically warn against co-signing loans for others. The data shows that co-signing almost always leaves you paying the bill, for sure. Next is the saving pillar. Did you know the average person is just 3 weeks away from bankruptcy? That's a truly terrifying statistic from our sources. To build a proper safety net, the rules are pretty simple. Start early, be incredibly consistent, and aim to save 2 to 3 months of salary for emergencies. And as a steward, you balance this by giving generously first, before you save, maintaining that perspective that, well, it's all God's anyway. Finally, let's look at the banking and investing pillars together. The sources point straight to the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. In this story, a master literally praises his servants who strategically invested his money and earned a return, while severely punishing the servant who just buried his resources in the ground out of fear. The lesson here is crystal clear. Use different bank accounts strategically and invest patiently and wisely to grow the resources you've been entrusted with. And that brings us to Section 5, the Rich Fool's Warning. To really anchor everything we've talked about today, we're turning to a famous narrative from the Gospel of Luke. It's known as the parable of the rich fool. Jesus tells the story of a man whose land produced so much wealth that he literally didn't have room for it. Instead of using his massive surplus to further God's will or, help others, he decides to tear down his barns, build bigger ones to hoard it all, and kick back for an early luxurious retirement. But God tells him he's going to die that very night. He was materially blessed, sure, but he completely missed the point. God asks the rich fool this piercing question, "And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" Our sources link this directly to Ecclesiastes 2:18. It totally challenges us to look at the ultimate purpose of singularly devoting our lives to wealth accumulation. Think about it. If you spend your whole life hoarding, you just leave it to someone else who didn't earn it. If money is your master, God is not. This leads us to the emotional and spiritual climax of biblical finance: contentment. The Apostle Paul writes that he has learned the secret of being content whether well-fed or hungry, living in plenty or in want. True peace? It doesn't come from having the latest of everything or achieving some massive material abundance. It comes from trusting and loving God's will, regardless of the numbers sitting in your bank account. To summarize the ultimate goals of this explainer based on our source texts, your objective isn't to get rich, it's to be rich toward God. We are blessed so that we can abound in every good work and bless others. We're called to cultivate godly character through diligent hard work and to live with the profound, totally stress-free freedom that comes from being a faithful steward, not a burdened owner. So, I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder as you look at your own budget and your own lifestyle. Are you currently managing the resources God gave you just to build a bigger barn for yourself, or are you using them to build His kingdom? It's a question that redefines absolutely everything. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we'll see you next time as we continue to break down more fascinating topics.